Okay, good morning, good afternoon, good evening to all of you tuning in today. It's great to have all of you on the line, quite a few familiar names and also a lot of newcomers, so a warm welcome to all. For those of you who don't know me yet, my name is Anharaz Lang. I'm the Executive Director of PHAP, which is short for the International Association of Professionals in Humanitarian Assistance and Protection, and it is my great pleasure to be welcoming all of you to this first session launching a new learning stream on the Humanitarian Development Peace Nexus, jointly organized by ICVA and PHAP. And I'd like to introduce my co-host today, Melissa Patati from ICVA.
Happy to be here today to talk about the nexus. It's become a topic that's more and more discussed within our network, exploring how humanitarian development and, when appropriate, peace action are supposed to be coming together. This issue of the nexus is very central to the discussion that we had in a previous webinar on the new way of working. It also comes across in discussions that we have in the policy world on the comprehensive refugee response framework. It comes up in discussions on UN reform. It comes up in discussions on the increasing role of the World Bank in fragility and conflict. And there's a lot of experience out there, organizations that have already been trying to tackle the nexus, including in the NGO community, but we still see a record number of questions coming out. So this is a great opportunity to dive into this topic today. So we want to thank all of you for participating, and also thanking the donors who've contributed core support that will make this possible. For ICVA, that includes Danita, Germany, ICVA Foundation, Swedish CIDA, Switzerland, and our ICVA members that helps make these lessons a reality. So I would like to introduce the structure and the content of today's session. We're going to first be introducing the concept of the triple nexus between humanitarian development and peace action. What does that mean exactly? What is currently being discussed? We'll then have some UN and NGO perspectives on their experiences working in the complex settings, more specifically about the practical challenges and opportunities coming from joined-up action.
Today's panel features 3 women coming from different backgrounds, from World Vision International, the UN in Senegal, and MSF, Doctors Without Borders, and with complementary expertise on the issues at stake. To start us off, it's my great pleasure to introduce Nina Nepesova, who oversees humanitarian policy and advocacy at World Vision International. She has over 14 years of experience in humanitarian relief and development. She's worked on a range of policy issues, including humanitarian coordination, conflict response, child protection, protection of civilians, and peacekeeping, financing, and fragile states governance. Nina, I'll give you the floor.
Thank you very much, and it's a real pleasure to be here. Just to check whether you can hear me well.
Yes, sounds great over here, Nina.
Great, thank you. So I'll really try to just jump straight in. I've been given a pretty wide topic to introduce them, and we don't have a whole lot of time. So let's just start off by thinking a little bit about what is this triple nexus that we've been discussing today. So I think maybe the easiest way to understand it is as an attempt to find effective solutions and limit fragmentation in the face of growing problems and limited resources. And sometimes the nexus is synonymously used with UN reform introduced by the UN Secretary General to make the UN system more effective to meet the Sustainable Development Goals across 3 pillars. So development system, peace and security, and the management within the UN itself. So just maybe to put this also into the broader context, I think everybody is, of course, quite familiar with the Sustainable Development Goals. But also, this triple nexus is happening when we're having a really extensive growth in violent conflict. And in 2016, more countries experienced violent conflict than at any time in nearly 30 years. And this surge in violence afflicts both low and middle income countries with relatively strong institutions. It kind of calls into question the long-standing assumption that peace will accompany income growth. So if current trends persist, for example, by 2030, by when we're hoping to achieve the Sustainable Development Goals, more than half of the world's poor will be living in countries affected by high levels of violence. And of course, this is driving the idea around the need for a triple nexus. And I think it's really important to also acknowledge that for decades, both in the humanitarian and development communities, kind of resisted discussions of violence for fear that it would securitize our disciplines. And in many ways, the fear was quite justified, but I think our tactic has somewhat failed, and the harmonization of security and aid debates have marched on despite our concerns. Maybe one thing to underline in terms of what has changed in the debate. A lot of the conversation at the moment is around the issue of prevention, and that's not new. I think what is different, though, is how we're talking about prevention. And the difference today is the realization that it's really about equity and inclusive decision-making, and meaningful civil society participation, and building cooperative behaviors, including diverse groups of people, and which is like fundamental to addressing violence and sustaining peace. And this is particularly evident in the latest World Bank UN report on pathways for peace. And if you haven't had a chance to read its summary, I highly encourage you to do so, to kind of really ground it in this triple nexus debate. And it's very interesting to see this come out from the bank, especially given its previous stance on the issue and the prevalence of discussions of the importance of economic growth as a driver of peace no longer being recognized as the case in every context. And this whole prevention issue is quite visible in the SDGs as well, the World Humanitarian Summit outcomes, the Grand Bargain, new way of working, and of course the overall growing engagement of the World Bank in the peace and humanitarian arenas in the recent years, and of course the SDG's own reports on the UN development system on peace building and sustaining peace. So overall, I think we could say that the theory is pretty good, and I think the debate is welcome. And indeed, harmonization is something that I think in practice, kind of in theory, we can all agree on, but in practice, this is where the questions start to arise. And the devil is very much going to be in the implementation detail. So that's what I would like to talk about next. And of course, I come at this problem with, from an NGO perspective, very much with my humanitarian hat on. And looking at the triple nexus and the way that it's been introduced within the UN system reform, there are a couple of concerns that I see, and they are mainly related to the lack of engagement of civil society in the discussions of the implementation of this nexus, or indeed even what specifically could it even look like, and potential reduction of civil society space within the proposed coordination forum. And there are a couple examples that I could draw to your attention. One of them is related to the UN country teams and the reconfigured country teams, which are going to specifically focus on Agenda 2030, alignment of national development priorities in each country against the achievement of the SDGs. And unfortunately, UN country teams don't have a formalized seat at the table for civil society, unlike, for example, the humanitarian country team. So what does that mean? Similarly, the new reinvigorated, stronger role of the resident coordinator, which overall I think is quite welcome, independent of UNDP, empowered to act, final say on the UN development assistance framework, even if there are disagreements within the UN country team participants, and actually being called as a one-stop shop resource for partnerships. But again, there's really no formalized civil society engagement link to the resident coordinator that's been articulated so far in what we've heard. And I think also important to raise here is the introduction of the Joint Steering Committee at the UNHQ level, where the ERC and the UNDP administrator can come together and really grapple with alignment of humanitarian development concerns, collective outcomes towards achieving the SDG agenda. And I think it's really important to have that platform for dialogue, but what's unclear at the moment is the relationship between the Interagency Standing Committee and the Joint Steering Committee. And the reason I raise this is because within the IRC, as NGOs, we do have some space to engage, we do have some space to influence. It is less clear for me at the moment how this will work within the Joint Steering Committee perspective, especially when there is no such space for us to engage with aspects of the UN Development Group and engagement with UNDP per se. So the other piece I do want to put out there is what I'm seeing and what I'm kind of noticing at the moment is that despite some joint analysis of the issues, some brilliant analysis from ICVA, Interaction, individual NGOs, we do really lack a common understanding of the problem and some common definitions. And I think sometimes even within the humanitarian community, we kind of lack the same vernacular to describe similar issues. And I hope that the discussion today will help us to start that process. But I do also want to encourage us to engage with non-humanitarian actors in the civil society space and the peace and development side of things, because I do feel that they have a lot to bring to the conversation, and we can really learn from one another. So moving on, and very important to acknowledge the implications for us as a community at the operational level of this proposed triple nexus. And there are a couple of issues here that I want to highlight that I think we really need to think about quite carefully. Obviously, the reform is linking us even closer to nation-state priorities, and the SDGs, of course, are a member state-led initiative. So what does this mean for us in protracted, fragile, and conflict context? What does this mean in the case of Syria, Somalia, or South Sudan, where states are also belligerent actors? And I haven't necessarily seen in either of the UN Secretary General's reports, for example, a clear articulation of the importance of humanitarian principles, especially in conflict context, and the importance of keeping that separation between several agendas within the UN. So the other piece for me is what I'm calling here is the protection gap. The SDGs in and of themselves are a pretty strong protection framework, but I'm not really sure how willing different entities of the UN will be to hold nation states accountable for violations in conflict, and whether the SDGs in and of themselves are a framework that is going to be good enough to meet what I would call fluid protection concerns, and do we risk neglecting these in difficult contexts where we operate? And all of this links, of course, to principled humanitarian action that I've already mentioned, but also I want to raise the issue of potential assistance biases. If the UN system is repositioning itself towards meeting the Sustainable Development Goals, which are, of course, much more longer term, more developmentally focused, what does this really mean for humanitarian imperative and meeting urgent needs? Is this going to clash with national development priorities? What flexibilities are going to be built in to address this? So having said all this, I do think that there is a way for humanitarian work to promote development and peace efforts, despite the need for us to recognize challenges with doing that. And to some extent, I do want to raise a couple of points here that relate to our colleagues on the development and peace-building side of things, especially within civil society. I don't necessarily believe that development and peace equals politicization. And I think a lot of discussion of this is kind of the two are equated to this in the humanitarian space somewhat unfairly. I also think that we need to be very careful about peace building and peacekeeping. These are not the same at all. And at the local level, peace building is a critical tool, including for opening up humanitarian space and for really improving protection outcomes for people we're trying to serve. I think there are also multi-mandated agencies out there like World Vision and others who have successfully worked across the triple nexus. And so I would really encourage us to learn from each other to better understand what are the problems that we're dealing with and how to operate together in the same space. I want to highlight one thing that Hugo Slim recently said in his remarks to the WFP, specifically talking about the triple nexus. And I think it's quite important for us to consider is that IHL is concerned with the nexus thinking and nexus obligations. And there is within IHL responsibility for social norms and governance systems to ensure dignified protection and survival. So I think as humanitarians, we do have an obligation to consider development and peace building in our work, which is not the same to say that we have responsibility for implementing development or peace building programming. And I think that alignment with SDGs is not about us giving up on IHL or humanitarian imperative, but I think it is about drawing lines of distinction that can bring us closer together with our partners in development and peace building realm without impacting our freedom to operate. And most importantly, I think it's also about changing mindsets and behaviors on all sides. I think as humanitarians, we have acknowledged for a long time that we've been faced with ever-growing demands that kind of stretch us to breaking point. But this does also mean that we have to allow others to come in and take things on. And to do this effectively, we have to be on the same page and have collective outcomes. And at the end of the day, I think the people whose lives we are trying to save don't really care and often don't know the difference between us, but they do know what they want. And in my experience, that's a life of dignity and fulfillment of their right to peace and to development. And I'd like to think that all of us are concerned with making this happen. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Nina. I think you've laid out a lot of good issues for us, and it's good that we have the next speaker coming from a different perspective. But I wanted to emphasize what you said. It's important for us to learn from each other. And in theory, we can agree, but in practice, the devil is in the implementation detail. While you were talking, Nina, we did have some polling. The results of the polls are here. Do you agree with the following statement? There is a lack of common understanding of the problem and there are no common definitions among different actors. Majority agree. Which of the following risks do you think is the most challenging for humanitarian actors when working with development and peace actors? The majority said compromising humanitarian principles. So this is very important. We had some other polls as well, which we'll try to unpack later. But I wondered on this lack of common understanding of the problem, Nina, if you wanted to dive a little bit further, because you talked about the issue of definitions, and we had a question from Jessica from Senegal on your point on the common vernacular. Her question was, how can the different communities work together to arrive at common definitions of resilience and vulnerability? Would you have any views on that, Nina?
I think I can speak to the experience that we have had within my own organization, which is indeed multi-mandated and kind of works across the triple nexus. And the simplest answer to this is to start a conversation. And very often we make a lot of assumptions and we don't necessarily come together to actually discuss the language that we're using to describe similar problematics. Very often we come together to address a problem. And the definitions that we use seem to be the same, but they mean quite different things within our space. And I think one of a really good example of that is the word resilience. And I think in many contexts, it means completely different things to different people. Certainly for my development colleagues, resilience is not necessarily about, for example, climate change or a livelihood. And for my colleagues on the peace-building side of things, it is about managing risk and building resilience to withstand conflict. And so in essence, I think it is really important for us to come together first and foremost, lay some of this terminology on the table that we seem to be using jointly, but that doesn't necessarily mean the same thing to us. And just kind of coming up with the same vocabulary to understand each other better is a good starting point. And has really worked for us in World Vision. And at the moment, we're going through a process of trying to understand better what is our theory of change for addressing fragility. This is really coming out in the discussions and the need to draw together and understand each other better is a real issue. And I think there needs to be a space that we need to build, at least within the civil society dimension, for the three different disciplines to have a conversation about that.
Thank you, Nina. Now we'll turn to Priya Gajraj, who's been appointed as UN Resident Coordinator and UNDP Resident Representative for the Republic of Senegal. Prior to this appointment, Priya was the UNDP Country Director in the Democratic Republic of Congo. She's provided oversight to strategic planning and programming of interventions in complex and post-conflict countries, so Mali, Nigeria, South Sudan, Niger, etc. She contributed to the development and implementation of the United Nations Integrated Strategy for the Sahel, and she's worked in the Somalia peace process with the World Bank and aid coordination mechanisms. When I met with Priya earlier, she talked about some interesting collaboration with the NGOs in her current work, and so we were really happy to have Priya here today to give us a UN perspective on the nexus. Over to you, Priya.
Good morning, everybody, and thank you, Melissa, and thank you to PHAP and ICVA for the opportunity to exchange with partners on the nexus this morning and to be part of this great panel of speakers. I'll obviously refer to my experience in Senegal, but also to DRC since I was there for the last 3 years. And really my remarks will be around 4 key messages. The first key message is that the nexus between the humanitarian and the development sphere responds both to the recommendations of the World Humanitarian Summit, but also to the agenda of the Sustainable Development Goals, or SDGs. For us, we see these 2 agendas as meeting the same imperative, which is that humanitarian and development actions converge around the need to prevent, prepare for, and respond to crises, especially for the most vulnerable and at-risk populations. Protracted crises are unfortunately the norm today, whether it's displacement, conflict, food insecurity. They're increasingly becoming cyclical and require efforts over the long term. There are multi-year approaches, including through humanitarian response plans, which are now enabling humanitarians to formulate responses to protracted crises, but these also need to be complemented with development investments designed to meet the needs of the SDGs. This can be done through the UNDAP, the United Nations Development Assistance Framework, which is a strategic medium-term results framework that describes the collective vision and response of the UN system to national development priorities and results on the basis of normative programming principles. The second message is that a humanitarian development nexus is not sufficient. What we need is a humanitarian development peace nexus. This involves humanitarian and development actors, obviously, but also peace-building actors as appropriate to the context. It's important to note, and this is one of the areas that still requires improvements, that planning and programming frameworks, whether you talk about peace-building plans, the UNDAP, or the humanitarian response plans, have not always been systematically aligned with each other in countries to date. Each framework includes activities, but there's oftentimes not a systematic relationship between the plans. And the distinction between humanitarian peace building and development is then often artificially reinforced by separate analytical tools, planning exercises, and funding mechanisms. The development of a new generation of UNDAs, as we're trying to do here in Senegal, is therefore an opportunity to improve coherence and coordination of interventions. And there are 3 ways in which this new generation of UNDAs can help in terms of advancing on the nexus. One is by having a more multidimensional approach to vulnerability and on building multi-sectoral solutions, combining tools and principles of humanitarian action and development efforts. The second way is through the common country assessment, which is the analytical basis for the UNDAP, which should include analysis of vulnerabilities as well as analysis of conflict and development. These elements need to ensure that they are people-centered and responsive to the needs of the most vulnerable. And the third way of moving forward is to ensure that we work around collective outcomes to which humanitarian development and peace actors can all contribute. This should contribute to reducing the needs, risks, and vulnerabilities of populations. My third key message today is that the main challenge to date in improving upon the nexus between humanitarian, peace, and development actors remains the lack of funding. Funding mechanisms are still directly related to specific plans and programs that make it difficult to plan, coordinate, and mobilize resources for the nexus or to reinforce the humanitarian development link. Without a concrete funding mechanism for humanitarian development initiatives, it will be difficult to mobilize partners around issues of mutual interest and collective outcomes. And my fourth and last message is around the new way of working, which seeks to transcend humanitarian development divide. Now, the goal of the new way of working is to meet people's immediate humanitarian needs while reducing risk and vulnerability and contributing to the SDGs. It's based around three key concepts: working towards collective outcomes over multi-year timeframes, and based on the comparative advantages of a diverse range of actors. And here I would like to underscore that that obviously includes civil society. Now, advancing on the new way of working can only be done at country level through concerted efforts to do business differently and to engage a variety of actors. In addition to empowered leadership, which the previous speaker highlighted, this needs to be bolstered by strengthened coordination between humanitarian development and peace actors that aim to realize shared analysis, better joint-up planning and programming, and financing modalities that can deliver on collective outcomes over longer time frames, in particular in protracted crisis settings. Now, in Senegal, we're moving forward on this new way of working through the UNDAF in a number of specific ways. The first way is we're working to directly integrate humanitarian issues into UNDAF planning. There will be no more separate humanitarian response plan for Senegal, unless obviously there is a severe humanitarian situation. The second is that we're setting up a platform of humanitarian and development actors to build on this joint planning and to help bridge the humanitarian development gap. And I'd like to emphasize that that platform includes civil society, both national and international. The fourth is that through our UNDAF consultations and in seeing how we integrate humanitarian and development issues, this has included civil society, again, both national and international partners as part of the process. We're also working on a strategy on resource mobilization to help accompany the UNDAF planning and the UNDAF instrument. Let me close by saying, though, that there's still challenges around the new way of working. Progress has been made, but efforts have been ad hoc and not systematic. It tends to be uneven amongst countries. The second challenge is that there's a growing demand for concrete examples and lessons learned in terms of new way of working implementation. Where there are still challenges in terms of the new way of working, there are three that I would highlight in particular. That progress has been made in advancing on the new way of working, but efforts have to date still been ad hoc and not systematic. There's an unevenness in terms of the progress. The second challenge is that there's a growing demand for concrete examples and lessons learned in terms of the new way of working and its implementation. But there still needs to be further clarity on what collective outcomes mean in different contexts. And the third challenge is that there's still varying levels of understanding of the new way of working within and across countries. So let me stop there, and again, thank you so much for the opportunity to exchange on this important issue this morning.
Thank you so much, Priya. We have a number of questions that have come in, so if I may, before we move on to introduce our third panelist, I'll pose a couple of these questions to you now. The first has come in from Nawaz, who's connecting to the event from Iraq. Nawaz writes, is there any guidance or joint analysis and joint planning across the humanitarian development and peace communities particularly in terms of alignment and compatibility of the UNDAF and humanitarian response plans, HRPs, at the country level. So I know you touched on both the HRPs and UNDAF in your presentation. Would you be able to elaborate a bit more on whether there's any guidance available for that kind of joint analysis or joint planning across the nexus, as Nawaz mentioned?
So I think there's some work underway with the OCHA colleagues on trying to see how we can move forward in terms of that joint analysis. So I can tell you there is thinking and proposals around how it could be done better. But what we're trying to do is to do it actually through the UNDAF. So instead of having two separate instruments, right now for Senegal, we're working on an UNDAF, and we also have a humanitarian response plan, which we launched in January. So the idea is now through our new UNDAF to integrate the two, so here we have actually one joint up analysis and planning framework.
Excellent, thank you. And another question that's come in from Garrett in Geneva, asking, from Priya's perspective, would the advantages of involving civil society in UNDAF, as they are in HRPs, outweigh the added complexity of doing so? Over to you, Priya.
I would say it's actually an advantage. I mean, I think, and this is the way we're moving forward in terms of at least the Senegal context, the platform that we are setting up, and we've agreed on terms of reference, includes humanitarian and development actors, and as I mentioned, civil society, both local and international, because at the end of the day, all of these actors are contributing to these issues. For me, I also don't see a contradiction with the SDG agenda, because the SDG agenda is actually calls for broader engagement of all actors in supporting both the nexus and the broader development outcomes. So I think, it's all very consistent. It's maybe more a matter of how we do it. But I definitely see it as an advantage, and I can tell you here, this is the way we're planning in moving forward, and I've already agreed on terms of reference on this.
Excellent. Thanks so much, and thank you for your inputs today. Incredibly helpful, and I'd like to note that in the polls we see a majority of people participating today actually are not familiar with UNDAF, so great to have these insights from you and the introduction to that perspective on the issues. Now, moving to our third and final panelist, it's my pleasure to introduce Velina Stoyanova, who is Humanitarian Affairs Advisor at MSF and leads the Emergency Gap Project. Velina has over 12 years of experience in humanitarian financing, policy development, and the aid system. Before joining MSF, she worked as a consultant specializing in humanitarian coordination, pooled funds, and donor governments policies. Velina, you have the floor.
Hello.
Yes, loud and clear.
Can you hear me well, first of all? Excellent. Well, I would like to thank PHAP and ICVA for organizing such a very interesting discussion this morning. And I'm going to speak from a slightly different perspective to my colleagues before. It was very interesting to hear Nina and Priya's presentation before that, framing the discussion in a very useful way. Where our position comes from, what I'm going to discuss is how, from the perspective of the Emergency Gap Project, we see the issue of the nexus. And I will be using a nexus, a new way of working, sort of interchangeably through my presentation. So as a humanitarian medical organization, you all know that MSF has long been concerned with the sector's ability to ensure sufficient presence and adequate delivery of emergency response in acute crisis. And that led us in the operational center in Barcelona to launch a project, the Emergency Gap Project, that wants to highlight the need for renewed commitment to stay on the ground and to deliver meaningful response wherever the needs happen to be, including in insecure and hard-to-reach places in conflict. So in the acute phase of a conflict, whether that would be a new conflict or an escalation of violence in a protected one. So for us, the emergency gap, that term we coined, is basically the lack of adequate life-saving services, and that includes protection in the right places, at the right time, in the acute phase of conflict-related emergencies. So a lot of what I will be saying, whether I mention it or not, will refer to this sort of acute conflict and highly politicized setting. So in that sense, we will examine each policy or operation vis-a-vis this emergency gap. So whether it has the potential to exacerbate or to contribute to the gap, or whether, on the contrary, it can actually bridge the gap and make this effective response in context of acute violence more effective. So the gap, this emergency gap, is a multi-cause phenomenon. There are external factors, very powerful. Nina mentioned the overloading of the plate of the humanitarian sector and our sort of stretching to a breaking point because of continuously mounting needs. There is also the changing geopolitical landscape and the potential for politicization of humanitarian action. And that places all sorts of challenges on us, but it also has led to erosion of a lot of the legal frameworks within the sector, within which the sector operates. As a result, we see a situation where humanitarian action is manipulated for other purposes, different than the humanitarian objective, and we've seen that in many places, such as Afghanistan, Mali, Iraq, or whether it's obstructed, or places where it's obstructed and denied. And Nina also mentioned the situation in Syria and how humanitarian action was prevented from reaching people in need. So these are external factors that are outside the control of the humanitarian community. So they are, in a way, thrust upon us, and we're forced to adapt and live with them. But then there are internal factors that are within our control and that shape how we, as a sector, equip ourselves to respond and to be effective. And they have to do with how we set up ourselves and how we equip ourselves to work, and that includes structures, tools, mechanisms, including financing mechanisms. I think Priya spoke about that, our ability to manage insecurity. It also has to do with the way we cultivate our impulse to overcome the obstacles, so what we have called the humanitarian emergency mindset. And it has to do with the way we conceptualize what the humanitarian mission is and how we relate to other policies. And this is where we connect with the idea of the nexus. Because what we have seen is that increasingly in the last couple of years, particularly with the impulse following the World Humanitarian Summit, we have moved to a conceptualization of humanitarian action as part of, in alignment with other wider agenda that go all the way from addressing chronic situations of poverty, vulnerability, for displacement, to political insecurity, counterterrorism, all the way to the peace nexus. So that has led to a growing pressure for us to align with these objectives. And we're speaking of alignment, which is probably the difference with previous agendas, and I guess we can discuss that in the Q&A, rather than on complementarity based on each approach and its strength and added value. So I've been asked to speak of three things, and I'm not going to spend the same amount of time on each one of them. The first one is the implications for principled humanitarian action. The second one is on how that affects NGOs working at country level in complex emergencies. And the third one is basically, is there anything positive about this new initiative? For us, it's hard to speak of principles in abstract because principles, humanitarian principles, are not just guidelines or something we evolve from time to time. They're critical tools that are needed for our ability to operate effectively and to operate on our sector's comparative advantage. So that said, we believe from this emergency gap analysis that there is conceptually a sort of fundamental tension between principled humanitarian action in conflict, in contested settings, and these transformative agendas that aim to correct injustices or aim to drive political, structural, society sort of wide changes. And for us, it kind of goes back to that potential of, or that risk rather, of reinforcing an existing tendency to politicize humanitarian action, to use it in a way that it actually impacts the people who need assistance. And it can be anything from the absence of sufficient services, and including protection on the ground, so hampering our ability to reach them, or the denial of that assistance to the people who happen to be on the wrong side of the crisis. And in that sense, from that idea of humanitarian principles, we do believe that the sector must maintain enough independence to ensure the ability to operate. So the practical side of this is how that impacts NGOs working in acute conflict. So as we know, today's conflicts are primarily internal, so states are very often parties to the conflict. So from that perspective, the question we believe we should be asking more clearly when examining these policies, and particularly when we think about how they're implemented on the ground, will be how we can ensure that if humanitarian action ends up being linked to these state peace building, counterterrorism agendas, or are framed as part of state strategies, we can still remain neutral and impartial. And we will still be able to reach people outside the government control areas. In practical terms, it is very likely that this new policy, when rolled out, may lead to a concentration, or greater concentration, because we already see that concentration of both actors and resources, including funding, on one side of a conflict. And the other potential damaging effect would be that the already existing obstruction of access and work for humanitarian access can actually become sanctioned or more accepted. We've seen that already in the field as part of the case studies in the emergency gap. We have a case study on Nigeria, and the obstruction of access has been clearly shown. So that has implications on a number of issues, including humanitarian space and the issue around protection. I'll speak of protection first because Nina also mentioned that. And it has to do with that inability or potential greater difficulty in being able to identify and address protection needs in adequate manner on both sides of that crisis. So just to quickly mention, go back to the issue of Nigeria, at the start of the crisis in northeastern Nigeria, our case study found that the whole humanitarian community, including donor governments, but also the implementing part of the sector, succumbed to the narrative of denial promoted by the government and not wanted to address, publicly recognize the situation as a large-scale conflict, which, of course, protection concerns such as for displacement were not addressed adequately and in a timely manner. On the issue of the humanitarian space, part of the external factors spoke of increased insecurity for humanitarian workers and for beneficiaries, closer alignment with stabilization initiatives or counterterrorism agenda in many of these acute violence situations, thinking of the case of Mali now, will certainly hamper our ability to gain access and to reach people in need. And finally, from our perspective, going back to our initial concern about that lack of capacity to respond adequately to the growing level of needs and to the growing challenges within which the humanitarian sector is operating, we're concerned with the lack of focus on the need to improve on-the-ground delivery of humanitarian assistance in emergencies. And we feel that the agenda, while it's calling for a very needed scale-up of presence of developmental actors and of new actors, is not clearly addressing, is not clearly setting forward steps for ensuring more ability, more presence, more capacity, and the right tools for us to be better able to respond on the ground in acute crisis. Is there a positive side to the new policies? I imagine we will have time to discuss this more in the Q&A, so the short answer is yes, there are lots of positives, particularly in the settings that initially generated the thinking around the nexus. So this would be the protracted for displacement settings in relatively stable countries. I'm thinking of Kenya, more recently the Syrian refugee situation, Jordan, Lebanon, etc. And the second caveat, provided that the risks to principal action in conflict, insisting on the fact that conflicts are now internal and the state is likely to be party to it, are properly assessed, addressed, mitigated, and that our context-specific analysis takes that into consideration when we start rolling out the new way of working in the field. And that's all for me.
Thank you so much, Valina. This has given us a lot of food for thought here, and we've had a lot of questions rolling in as you spoke. So before we've got the polls here. We can look at the polls a little bit and then throw a question. How will working more closely with development and peace actors change the degree that humanitarian aid is driven by political rather than humanitarian priorities? The most votes went to increasing somewhat about the decision-making calculus being more driven by political rather than humanitarian, which you actually touched on several times in your presentation, Valina. And one of the issues that came across in the Q&As, we heard in the last presentation the creation of in Senegal of a platform for NGOs to engage and other actors to engage in the UN processes related to the UN Development Assistance Framework. So the question came from Habi to you, Valina. Considering all of the UN reform efforts and the promotion of the nexus and this finding that civil society and NGOs in general have little space to engage and either are not involved at all or are marginally involved in these programming frameworks at the country levels. From an MSF perspective, because you have a very unique approach to collaboration at the country level, what would you recommend or suggest or at least observe in terms of how can this engagement be better done at the country level, at the same time recognizing the concerns you've raised about the principles and the need for decision-making to still be driven by the humanitarian imperative?
As you mentioned, we have a particular approach to collaboration in the field, and we're certainly not engaged in the discussion around the rollout of the new way of working or the nexus in the field. So that kind of puts us in a strange position to suggest better ways of collaborating. But I think Nina mentioned that in her presentation, that different organizations have, in a way, in a more organic way, because of their mandate or the types of settings they work in, they have experience with working across the nexus and working with different actors. And I will echo her call for starting up a discussion and having a dialogue that actually takes practical experiences in consideration when building the strategy for implementing this in the field. Because one of my major concerns when it comes to this, how the new way of working, how the nexus will be rolled out and implemented, is, in addition to the lack of clarity, which I think we can all agree on, is that when we hear about context specificity in the nexus agenda, it very much sounds like case specificity to me. So it sounds like we are not considering context as in the types of settings, and I do believe that the specificity of conflict and acute conflict is very much missing from this analysis. And we think about rolling things out based on each case. So for a medical organization, that will be like going forward without medical protocols. It will be like, let's treat each case depending on the particular circumstances. Well, that usually doesn't work out very well for, to begin with, to ensure effectiveness, to ensure that things are done in the best possible way, and to ensure that there is no discrimination. So what I would call for is, let's have a discussion based on the practical implications of working across actors, across settings, and across policies in the field. And I think there are very valid experiences out there, and I think we from MSF can bring our experience much better into this discussion.
Thank you, Valina. So to start our Q&A session, I want to pose a question to each of the speakers. It's a question that we get almost every time we open a meeting about the nexus. And the question in a nutshell is this really new? What is new? Inga from the Netherlands posed it this way. The discussion on the nexus has been on the agenda for decades. It's been called in the past LRRD, which was Linking Relief, Rehabilitation, and Development. It's been taken up in resilience discussions. But as far as Inga can see, there hasn't been that many changes in practice, especially not in the area of financing and not in the area of collaboration between actors, and particularly among donors. So concretely, at the operational level, what are we seeing that's new? A program officer in Ethiopia asked this as well, and then took it a step further by saying, what should we be doing differently this time around to make it a reality in terms of taking it to scale? So on this question, what is new, what can we do differently, I'd like to go to each of our speakers in the order of the presentations. So maybe, Nina, could we start with you?
Yes, absolutely. Thanks, Melissa. I think it's a really great question. And at this stage, it's a question that's a little bit difficult.
Nina, could you speak a little bit louder? It's a bit soft, your voice. If you could try even more to be louder, that would be. Speak closer to your microphone. Yes, thank you.
Okay, I literally haven't changed.
Yes, that's much better. Thank you.
This is better. Okay, fantastic. Sorry about that, everybody. So I think it's a fantastic question for us to be asking ourselves. And I think this is also the time for us to actually influence what the answers look like. In many ways, what we're seeing is the introduction of some new theoretical proposals
And the implementation process for these is only just beginning. So I think this is why I'm a little bit concerned about the lack of clear space for civil society consultation and engagement in the rolling out of all of these and what it can effectively look like. So I think as a humanitarian community, this is a time for us to ask for that to be put in place. And as a result, to also inform what this can look like by coming together and addressing some of these questions. I think some time will pass before we see some detailed protocols that are hitting the ground. And Priya's presentation was really informative. And the fact that even with the new way of working, which was rolled out during the World Humanitarian Summit, introduced rather at the World Humanitarian Summit and then started its rollout, we're not yet necessarily seeing specific lessons from how it's being implemented across the board. And this is not necessarily because it's not being done. It is because such little time has actually passed for us to have meaningful learning come out of this situation. So I think I would really encourage us to think about what we want ourselves to see from the triple nexus, come together, come up with some very specific recommendations based on our field experience, and then really request for that civil society space to come in and influence the conversation around implementation that are happening within the border system.
Thank you, Nina. How about you, Priya? What do you think on this issue of what is new, what can we be doing differently to make it a reality?
Thank you very much, and I also think it's a very good question, and I actually agree with the person who asked the question. I don't think it's a new issue. I think we've been struggling as to how to operationalize it for a long time. But it's not a new agenda. It's maybe another form of the same agenda. However, what I think is new about the discussion, and I think there's a strong pressure within the UN for us to, as part of the reform, to work in a more joined-up way towards these collective outcomes, towards more multi-year frameworks, towards delivering on results. And we feel that pressure politically, we feel that pressure financially. So I would say that's different, and that the UN reform is maybe putting more momentum in terms of this agenda. What I would also say is new is I think, at the field level, and I think this is where it's encouraging, the actors on the ground are trying to find ways to operationalize it. And I've mentioned what we're trying to do here, to have one common planning instrument that integrates these issues rather than having separate instruments, that we have a platform which brings actors together. And, not saying that, this is the perfect response, but at least, we're testing ways of addressing the issue and then building in flexibility so that we can adjust along the way. So I think, that to me is encouraging as part of the discussion, and I think we all need to continue to support that. I do think, and I mentioned this in my presentation, I do think financing is the key, and I mean, I think we haven't heard from donors in terms of this particular webinar, but I actually think providing financing modalities to help support this agenda will be really critical in seeing it move forward.
Thank you, Priya. Indeed, your point on donors is well taken. We've received so many questions on the funding aspects and donor behavior that we're going to take a close look at that as we design the upcoming webinars. How about you, Valina? What do you think on this question of what is due and what can we do differently this time around?
I think the main aspect that is new is the level of drive there is behind this agenda now. I think there is a much stronger momentum than for any of the previous iterations of the Nexus. It possibly has to do with the fact that this new sort of surge of the Nexus agenda came at the back of the European refugee crisis. which the name itself, the way we speak of it already says a lot. So there is the sense that this was an issue, an urgent issue and an important issue to contend with, that it had political, social, economic costs for us, for the donors, for the people who drive the agenda. So I think there is much more momentum. I think there is, although we need, as Priya said, to hear from donors and what they're willing to do differently. I do think there is stronger desire to put the money where the mouth is, and to actually bring World Bank money, for instance, is also an important change. What we can do differently to make this work this time around? Well, I would start by saying, let's stop thinking of the nexus in an abstract sort of policy way. Most policies, when they stay at the policy level, make perfect sense, because we try to address very valid points, very broad points in very complex world. But the devil is in the detail. So let's stop thinking about the nexus as something that has to apply everywhere, every time, in every context. Let's go to what we know. Let's go to clearly examining the challenges we know we already face. Let's see how that relates to the key assumptions behind the nexus, and let's find solutions for that. And it may be that it's not applicable in every context. And I don't mean in every case, I mean in every context, in every type of crisis. It may mean that we need very clear checks and balances. We need to examine the potential as well as the risks.
Excellent. Thank you so much. I'd like to go back to Nina. We received a question from Aruna in Belgium. This issue, you mentioned, Nina, that World Vision has more than a humanitarian mandate. It's looking at development issues as well. So you've got a multi-mission perspective. And it's really connected to Aruna's question. When you have multi-missioned organizations who are acting in multiple capacities to alleviate humanitarian suffering on one hand and to promote development, and some organizations even have political objectives, advancing security, some of the questions we received about stabilization. How does a multi-missioned organization, not just World Vision, but more broadly, make sure that political motivations aren't determining their humanitarian policies? How can we make sure that we're apolitical and unconditional, independent, more in line with humanitarian principles when making decisions about our contributions?
I think that's a really great question, and I'm not really sure about how other organizations try to address it, but in World Vision we have some very serious guidelines and policies on this issue that recognize that we are a multi-mandated organization, and the most important aspect that drives our work is, of course, vulnerability of the people that we're trying to serve. And in many ways, meeting the needs of the most vulnerable communities is what determines the strategies that we apply. And indeed, we've stayed for many years in very protracted, fragile contexts, where we have seen that it gets very difficult to operate because of belligerent state and non-state actors. And in some cases, even in those contexts, we have been able to implement programming that is, for example, linked to local capacities for peace building. And not every level within a community is politicized. I think it's really important also for us to understand that the sheer presence of humanitarian actors on the ground already makes us involved in whatever we like to call politicization of anything that we do. So our presence in and of itself is already an important act within the spectrum of how things work in any given context. So I think we just need to also realize that humanitarian imperative and principles and their application are not happening in a vacuum. and that people's needs, they also don't just stop because, for example, they're lacking in food security or clean water, and if we provide it, then everything goes to normal. For them, people have a long-term objective for their own personal development of their children, and of course for peace. And not all local actors are political, but they do have political ideas, and we just can't step away from this dimension. So within this context, focusing on vulnerability and needs is probably one of the most important issues. Obviously, ensuring that we are functioning within international legal frameworks that apply in that context is really important. And I do also want to state that humanitarian action is based on a rights-based framework. So in many ways, it is related to social rights and economic rights in more ways than one. And I think that in many ways, from the perspective of World Vision, we have found that as a multi-mandated organization, we're able to understand this and to really contextually find appropriate interventions to meet people's needs. And I think a good example of that may be something that we have done in the Central African Republic, where we had serious issues around religious and ethnic conflict. And we were able to work with religious groups and religious leaders to really better understand what the problems were within their communities, and to really understand what kind of dividers and connectors existed, and to facilitate a better understanding through bringing these faith communities closer together around what the needs in the community are. And by bringing together religious leaders both from Christian and the Muslim side, we were able to ensure that Muslim IDPs in Christian communities were able to access markets, were able to access aid, were able to really better understand and live alongside their Christian counterparts. And so in some ways this was done through a really strong peace-building approach. I mean, in another situation, for example, in Somalia, where we have seen protracted crises last for literally decades, we formed consortia and partnerships. A great example is the Somali Resilience Program. I'm sure many organizations on this call are aware of it. And again, you know, we've come together with other partners in the NGO and non-NGO community to see how can we address a protracted crisis that goes beyond just saving lives, but actually helps people to respond to their livelihood needs in the longer term. And that has worked really successfully as well.
Thank you, Nina. It's coming across very strongly in a lot of the questions and the comments, this importance of putting people at the center, putting people first, and organizing ourselves around that. I'd like to turn now to Priya because we received a question. It just called your name indirectly about leadership. Emma from the UK was emphasizing the importance of leadership. NGOs have long had reservations when it came to integrated missions, integrated UN missions. The concerns are still there with regard to these discussions related to the nexus. And the resident coordinators, their leadership and their understanding to take these concerns seriously is very important. The UN country teams prioritizing humanitarian concerns, the need for UN leadership to uphold principles within these discussions. It's not always happening at the moment, but it's important, especially now it's very interesting to see with the discussions on UN reform, empowering resident coordinators. And from your unique vantage point, wondering what you think about that intervention there. Over to you, Priya.
I mean, I think, you know, this is the whole ongoing discussion that's happening in terms of the UN reform. I mean, I think it's very clear in the Secretary General's report that, you know, there's a new generation in terms of leadership, in terms of instruments that they want to put in place to adapt the UN. And the UN, I'm talking about the UN broadly, UN, you know, humanitarian development, political, to, I think, the realities of today's world. And I think part of the conversation in terms of the empowered leadership is, to me, is twofold. One is, you know, and being in this job as RC, there's a lot of responsibilities being put on the RC. So, you know, do we have the right, you know, are the right leaders in place in order to be able to conduct these strategic conversations within the UN, but outside the UN, with the NGO community, but also with the government. But at the same time, do the RCs, I mean, have the capacity in place to enable them to conduct that empowered leadership? So I think the conversation is happening at two levels. Is how do you, in this today's world, have this empowered leadership in terms of the resident coordinator, humanitarian coordinator, and what is the best fit for that. But at the same time, those RCs, HCs also need to have the capacities, the skill sets in place to enable them to deliver on that. I mean, just here in Senegal, there are 34 UN agencies that, you know, I have to coordinate with. I mean, it is, you know, it is a full-time, you know, full-time job, which demands a lot of efforts, and those require also having the capacities, the resources in place to be able to deliver on that and deliver on that well. So I think when we look at empowered leadership, there's a couple of conversations. The third strand on that is, to me, empowered leadership in RC doesn't mean that the RC or the HC will do everything. I think there are others within the UN country team, and I think within the broader community, that can lead on things and where the UN can support. So I think it's also about building those relationships, building those partnerships strategically. And I think that's, you know, that's what, when we talk about empowered leadership, I think there are different strands of conversation and different, you know, pieces of thinking on that, you know, are trying to come together as part of the UN reform. Thank you.
Thank you. And then we'll turn for our last question. It's unfortunate we have so many, but we'll follow up definitely to Valina on this issue of timing and pace and sequencing. We received a question from Fatma in Pakistan. From a humanitarian perspective, how can we address the issue of the difference in pace when working with development partners? The World Bank and other development actors usually take months, while humanitarian actors are used to working or delivering in a shorter time frame. It's quite relevant to your work on the emergency gap. So it's responding quickly. At the same time, we received a question from Lisa in the OPT about this focus on the nexus, looking at multi-year timeframes, multi-year strategies, because of the fact that we're operating more and more in protracted crises. Doing this multi-year approach should allow for empowerment of more local, national organizations towards sustainable growth. And how can we get more donors to step up and fund multi-year approaches concretely? What are your thoughts from your unique vantage point on this, Selena?
Thank you, Melissa. On the first question of the different timings between humanitarian and development, yes, it's true that humanitarians are used to working in shorter, sort of more fast-paced manner. But actually, also one of the things we've seen with the project is that this is less and less so. Well, the reason for that is linked to the second question, and it is that most humanitarian actors, us included, MSF, we work increasingly in the same context for a long period of time. Even acute emergencies, Syria, is now lasting for years. So I think humanitarian actors are becoming better at handling multi-year horizons, both in terms of planning and in terms of implementation. So I think I don't really see any fundamental pace challenge in this. What I'm mostly concerned with from the perspective of the Emergency Gap Project is that as we align our structures with the reality of the way we work, so as our mechanisms catch up with the reality on the ground and the fact that we have been working for a long time over multi-annual horizons, and the fact that over 2/3 of humanitarian assistance is spent in the same country year on year as a predominant form of international aid for more than 8 years in a row is telling. While we get better at aligning instruments, mechanisms with the reality, that we do not lose sight of the need to remain able to respond quickly in a timely manner to scale with adequate form of response, so that we also retain this quick emergency response focus and the ability to implement it. That would be my main concern. On the second question on multi-year strategies, and I believe you asked how we can get donors to step up and fund multi-year to support this concrete initiative. Well, I think many donors, well, quite a few donors have made efforts over the years to fund multi-year horizons. Of course, there are practical issues around that, and now I'm not really speaking from an MSF perspective because we do not work with government donors in conflict settings and increasingly accept less and less government funding. But from my sort of previous life as humanitarian financing expert, the main issue, of course, with that is the fact that while commitments are multi-annual, the disbursements tend to be on an annual basis because for most donors, their humanitarian budgets are on an annual basis. I am sure that with this renewed impulse behind the initiative, donors will be looking for ways to make that happen, and particularly in protracted situations of protracted vulnerability, chronic needs, particularly in more stable contexts. I think that alignment behind multi-annual strategies for all actors is going to have very important impact, including on empowering local organizations, local civil society organizations.
Excellent. Thank you. We are approaching the end of our allotted time today, unfortunately, because we have so many great questions still coming in, and it's been an excellent, very interesting discussion, not only in the Q&A with our expert panel, but also in the very rich discussion taking place in the chat. So thankfully, this is the very beginning, and we have a number of events still to come in this series, and it will be very useful to incorporate all of the inputs from the discussion today, including all of the questions that have come in to inform the developments of the upcoming events in this series. And now I would like to, if I may, turn once again to each of our panelists, Nina Nepesova, Priya Garaj, Velina Stoyanova, and ask you if you'd like to take just another minute or two to share any parting thoughts. If you would like, we do have one last question that came in from April in Geneva that could be a useful way to think about wrapping up the discussion. She observes that many people spoke about the need to be cautious with the risk of compromising humanitarian principles, and would appreciate if there is any wisdom you have to share regarding what and how you think we can prevent or reduce or diminish this compromise when it comes to humanitarian principles and looking at work in or across the nexus. But feel free also to share any other concluding points that you may have in mind. So first to you, Nina, you have the floor.
Thank you very much, and I want to thank everyone for an incredibly rich discussion. I think all the questions and comments are phenomenal. Priya, Velina, this has been really wonderful to hear your perspective. I think maybe in conclusion, one thing that I would like to say is I keep coming back to my point around the idea that we do really need to develop a similar vernacular and some understanding of what we're talking about when we refer to development and peace-building actors. In the conversation that we have today, when, for example, I speak with an NGO hat on as a representative of a form of civil society has very specific rules, guidance, and regulations around how we fulfill our kind of multi-mandated vision and mission and different contexts. Whereas a lot of the concerns that we seem to have in common is to do with development and peace-building actors that are donors, that are political actors that are making political decisions. And in some cases, we seem to equate the two. And I think we need to be clearer about which actors at which level we're talking about. And that will really help us to have a more constructive dialogue that is very practical and that is grounded in our own experiences. I do agree with many on this call that we are seeing a politicization of the aid agenda at large, and it is incredibly worrying. And the developments with donors who we used to consider to be champions of humanitarian action, humanitarian principles, kind of going that way as well. And particularly for me, at least, apparent on the Security Council and in different large multilateral decision-making. We're also seeing, for example, at the European Union level. But it's not the same as development and peace building at the local level on the ground by civil society. And I think we need to really make sure we differentiate between that and understand what this means when we talk about this issue. The other issue around humanitarian principles and how do we safeguard these. Responsibility for safeguarding humanitarian principles, I think, lies with us. And as actors on the ground in conflict settings, in fragile contexts, it is predominantly our responsibility to live out humanitarian principles where we operate. And sometimes I think we can do better as a community, as a humanitarian community, to really stand up for the principles and come up with joint ways of operating, agreements in some of the most difficult contexts. I've seen this work well in Somalia. I think we could really do better in some other places, and certainly have a lot to learn from each other on how to do this well. Thank you so much for the opportunity to speak to you about everything today.
Excellent. Thank you, Nina, and thanks once again for being with us. We look forward to discussing with you again in the future. Now, Priya, you have the floor.
Thank you so much, and again, thanks for the opportunity for engaging this morning, and it was a really rich set of exchanges and comments shared online, and I think very helpful to all of us, and to me in particular. I'd say a couple of things. I think, to me, there is this, momentum that's created in terms of this nexus, the new way of working, and I think let's use that positively. I mean, if there is a momentum to think how we can be more strategic, work better together, I think that's very, to me, that's very positive. So I see this discussion, I see, the engagement around this issue as, is very positive, very dynamic, and to me, let's make the most out of it. I think in doing so, there's a couple of things for me, that we should keep in mind. I think there's a lot of innovation at the field level, and a lot of things that are happening at the field level, and how we can better support that, or support that in moving forward and influencing, the discussions that are happening at the corporate level. I'm a big believer in the field level, and that a lot of good things are happening in the field, and to me, I think that, part of this conversation and the momentum needs to be about that. And also building in flexibility in terms of the process. I don't necessarily think we'll get everything right from the start, but are we going in the right direction, and are we adjusting along the way? And I shared some of what we're doing here in Senegal, not saying that it's perfect, but at least we're trying to advance, and, we'll adjust along the way, and I think that's what we need to keep on encouraging. And my last point, and I think one of the previous speakers referred to this, is really to look at the specificity of settings and context when we discuss the nexus and moving forward. I mean, I was in DRC previously, now I'm Senegal. It's two completely different contexts and conversations. And I think, that to me is also one of the guiding principles in terms of framing this conversation. How do we safeguard, humanitarian principles is, to me, a different conversation in DRC than it is in Senegal. And I think, again, we need to be able to adjust our approach, adjust, the way we work, and adjust our thinking in terms of the nexus, in terms of the specificity of the context and what is being asked of us in terms of, humanitarian community in terms of those contexts. Thank you very much.
Thank you. On the issue, on the question of how we can safeguard humanitarian principles, I'll build on what both Priya and Nina said. The specificity of context, examining context, is something that we have covered very, very much in detail in the Emergency Gap project and in the different reports. It is fundamental. And I can agree more with Nina's point that safeguarding humanitarian principles lies with us, with the humanitarian community. So in that sense, I would like to call on donors, on the UN, to allow organizations to maintain enough independence to ensure that we can uphold the principle of humanity and to deliver assistance when it's needed, to do it in a neutral way so that we can deliver assistance on all sides of a conflict based on needs rather than on any other long-term overarching policies, and even when they're so worthwhile as the SDGs. So when we think about the implementation on the ground, to keep that idea of context specificity in mind, and also what is needed for humanitarian organizations to maintain that independence practically, from perspective of funding, from perspective of coordination structures, from the perspective of analysis of needs and implementation plans. Thank you. And thanks very much, Angert and Melissa, for organizing this discussion today. It's been really great for me to hear the perspective of my co-speakers. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thanks, Selena, and really a pleasure to have you on the line today. Now, for all of our participants, I'd like to let you know that the recordings and all of the various resources that have been mentioned and linked in the chat, those will all be compiled and available within the next few days on the event webpage. You'll also be notified by email once those are online. In addition, we will be creating a transcript of the event and translating that into French and Arabic. Those will then be set up as subtitled versions of the recording, and once again, you'll be notified by email once those are up.
Thank you, and have no fear if you asked a question and it wasn't answered today. We're going to be working hard together, ICVA and PHAP, to get the answers. ICVA will be putting together a briefing paper on today's discussion, and I'd like to ask you to put 2 events onto your calendar. First, on the 24th of May, it will be the 2nd session of the learning stream on the Nexus, and we're going to focus on the role of the World Bank in the context of fragility and conflict. The World Bank is seen by many in the Nexus discussion as a game changer, and we're also going to hear from NGOs about their experience engaging with the World Bank in complex settings. So please click on the banner for more information. And second, I'd like you to put on your calendar, if you have time, the 8th of June. It's our 3rd topic in our learning stream on the Nexus, and we're going to look deeper at the issue. Nina spoke about it a lot today, as well as Priya, the UN reforms that are being rolled out in relationship to the Nexus. What does it mean for NGOs and other non-UN actors? What does it mean for humanitarian action? You can already register for that one by clicking on the banner. And before I hand over to Angeret, I just want to thank so much our speakers, but also thank the team here, Angeret, Marcus, and a big thank you to Liz, been a pleasure working with you, Liz. Thank you to Nishani for helping on the ICVA side and the others. As we said today, it's really important for us to come together to try to have similar understanding and meaningful learning. So over to you, Angharat.
Great. Thanks, Melissa, and a tremendous pleasure to co-host with you once again. Look forward to many more valuable discussions in the future. It's been great to have you all on the line, and I think that's it. We've covered it, and look forward to seeing you next time. Please do make sure to fill in that survey, as mentioned by Liz in the chat. Thanks. This is Anharad and the rest of the ICVA and PHAP team signing off from Geneva.